name is Cynthia Haven, and I've been a visiting scholar here at Stanford. I'm pleased tonight to introduce our guest from Moscow, the poet, publisher, journalist, essayist, and I'm proud to say, my friend, Maria Stepanova. She was born in Moscow in 1972 and graduated from the Gorky Literary Institute in 1995. She was twice awarded the Znamya Prize, the first time in 1993. The prestigious Bialy Prize and the Pasternak Prize both were awarded to her in 2005, and the Hubert Borda Fund Prize the following year. In fact, she was already a prominent and innovative poet by the time Putin came to power. But the times called for her to take a tougher and more public stance. Today, she is one of the most visible figures in post-Soviet culture, not only as a poet, journalist, and publisher, but also as a powerful voice for press freedom. She's the founder of Kolta, the only independent crowd-funded source of news that exists in Russia today, with 900,000 unique visitors a month. The online magazine has been called the Russian Huffington Post in format and style, and also compared to the New York Review of Books for the scope and depth of its essays. I'd like to take a minute to explain the Kolta story because it's a good story in a country that doesn't offer many of them at this historical moment. Kolta began with the online open space, which Maria founded in 2007. What she envisioned was a cultural daily, something that would provide Russians with a new point of view, with up-to-date and passionate expressions. But she soon learned that the culture couldn't stand apart from the political and social changes that were occurring. Private funders pressured Maria to cover more entertainment and less news. Kind of sounds like America. She resisted. The differences came to a head in 2012 when nervous funders pulled their support altogether in a political climate that was growing increasingly hostile to independent journalism. She and her colleagues received compensation when the website was terminated, and together they used their severance packages to launch a new website, Kolta, with volunteer help. Kolta was born only a few months after the demise of open space, and it was funded by ordinary Russians. Kolta had a vital role to play. As the official media, whether print or broadcast or internet, became more propagandistic and more xenophobic, Kolta offered an alternative. It became the place where you could find unfiltered information on what is going on in the wider world, without even a paywall to close out the young, the impoverished, or the far-flung readers of Russia. Kolta has been a success for 4 years. But let us not forget that some consider Maria to be Russia's greatest living poet. She is the author of 10 volumes of 10 poetry collections, and continues to get international prizes and recognition in recent years, including a Joseph Brodsky Fellowship, and last year a fellowship with Vienna's Distinguished Institute for the Human Sciences. To that end, I encourage you all to attend a reading tomorrow night in Russian by Maria of her poems. It will take place at 6 p.m. in the German Library, room 252 of Pickett Hall. Maria's talk tonight will consider Russia's current obsession with a patchwork of different visions of the past, where one can take shelter from an uncertain future. Yet, as she points out, the future is inevitable, whether we welcome it or not. Let's welcome Maria Stepanova.
Dear friends, thank you so much for being here in this day. It is so important for me to be here and to be able to share with you what I have to say about the current situation in Russia. First of all, I want to say my thank yous to the good geniuses after a letter to Cynthia and to Lucas. Thank you for making it all real. And I have to apologize for my rusty English. I am still trying to get it back into command, and it is not always successful. So, as a Russian citizen, I'm often getting asked different kinds of questions on the current situation in Russia and its numerous aspects, political, legal, and moral. And there is a special brand of question that is my favorite. It is, so to say, prognostic. In fact, I was asked it just a few days ago in Portland while giving a reading at PSU. It is what will happen next? What will come out of it all? And not being a sociologist nor a futurologist, what I can do is only to wave my hands or to tell a joke. I was told once it is bad taste in Germany to start a lecture or a talk with a joke. I don't really believe that, but anyway, we're in the US, so I'll tell you one. It goes like that. Can a woman become a president of Russia? The answer is technically yes, practically no. Why? Because Putin is not a woman. So, if Russia's future was predictable and our authorities stick to this notion, it would be ages and ages of Putin's regime. There is one more joke about it. Putin is asked to write his testament, and he hesitates, then he thinks it over, then says, well, why not? And leaves everything to Vladimir Putin. But we know that there is nothing predictable about the future, and especially in Russia. And that's the focal point of the few thoughts I am going to share with you. Not being a scholar, all I can offer is a mix of a report and a testimony. For in the last 20 years, I was deeply involved in what was happening in the Russian media field. The big changes it was suffering, some of them involuntary, some a result of constant efforts of the Russian state, are mirroring the changes in a way that Russian society is seeing itself and its place in the world. These changes are multi-layered, and they have completely transformed our notions of journalism as both a product and a profession. And the changes affect everyone. Nonetheless, the Russian situation is entirely unique. I will try briefly to explain in the hopes that my unhappy experience can serve to help understanding the general whole, the heterogeneous unity that makes up our contemporary world. I often have to speak and think about the systemic crisis that independent media outlets in Russia are facing. In contrast to the tectonic shifts that are happening in the Western media, this crisis is totally and 100% man-made. It's a result of deliberate efforts, of calculated policy, which over the 15 years of the Putin regime has led to more or less total substitution of classical media outlets by phantom or sham television channels or newspapers or internet projects, the sole objective of which is to imitate the existence of a free press under unfree conditions. In fact, even now, against a backdrop of political and economical crisis, so much money are invested in the creation of those projects that it could fund the budget of a small state. As a Brezhnev-era ideologue, Mikhail Suslov once said, "We don't skip on ideology." In this way, as in so many others, the realities of Putin's Russia are a parodic copy of its predecessor, the Soviet Union. The methods used to destroy the independent press are designed to dismantle, one by one, any and all publications that could compete with the phantom media. The only term I could use to describe the whole thing is something dating from the times of the First Chechen War. It is a term zachystka. The Russian speakers know the word, and for the others I will explain that it means total and absolute deconstruction of every trace of human life on a territory that is considered to be dangerous. 15 years have passed since the first zachystka, the destruction of NTV, the independent TV channel that was a leading one in the 90s. And in the meantime, the biggest television channels, the biggest publications, and even entire publishing houses have been shut down or forcibly reformed. How it was working? There is an example of Kommersant. That was the oldest and most respectable independent publication in post-Soviet Russia. It was enjoying an impeccable reputation for over 20 years. In 2007, the previous owners sold it to Alisher Usmanov, an oligarch with no former interest in the media field. And for almost 5 years, things were just going on, and the editorial policy and the figures were staying the same. Then, and from December 2011 to 2013, and it is no coincidence with the wave of protest movements in Russia, not only in Moscow, but all over Russia, the publication was rapidly going through a number of shock treatments, sacking of editors and general managers, and closing and reshaping successful projects, and pressing journalists to omit this and that, and in fact effectively destroying the whole. And now we can say that the publication is sufficiently loyal and hardly reliable. Now the focus is on a new and complex task, attempting to control the internet. The real picture of what has happened is this: the media has essentially ceased to be a business. For owners and investors, the risks associated with such dangerous properties are outweighing the financial and reputational gain. They are looking to divest themselves of their media concerns, and they make strategic and personnel decisions without even taking into account the business component. The journalism education, like the entire system of humanities education, is also as good as destroyed, and professional standards are eroding or being done away with. State media outlets essentially embrace the yellow press in every sense, organizationally, stylistically, ideologically. There is also an impressive example of Life News. That's a big yellow paper and a TV channel that for the last few years was sharing the managing the working space sources and even journalists with the Izvestia, a formerly respectable daily newspaper that now was managed by Aram Gabrilyanov, who is always parodying his loyalty to the authorities in a kind of Kadyrov-like fashion. The media outlets, in fact, he is known to say in an interview that he is going to shoot anyone for Putin. It is very much imitating Kadyrov's style of making jokes and talking things. At the same time, yes, the media outlets that are controlled by Gabrilyanov are also known for publishing slivy, an other slang word, meaning bits of information that the special services want to spread around. At the same time, laws are being adopted at many levels that makes a journalist's work impossible. There are laws on revealing sources. There are laws against the foreigners working in the media, laws on foreign agents and on undesirable organizations. In fact, their name is legion. But what is now at stake above all is the internet, and first and foremost, social networks, which now fulfill the function of the news media when real media outlets cannot fulfill their functions professionally. But with everything I tried to detail, the worst type of deformation that can happen in journalism and to journalists is an internal deformation. In Soviet times, it was called self-censorship, or the internal editor, an inner entity that is successfully preventing you from saying the real thing as it is. It is a shaky moral situation, in fact. When the decision whether to report facts has to be made on you every time. And when you are doing that, you have to weigh not only you are weighing not only the reliability of your sources, and the importance of information you have gotten, but also the problems that the publication of dangerous information can create for a publication and its employees. You are thinking if they should shut down the site, or if they should sack the editor-in-chief, or make a journalist lose his job. And as a result, journalists and editors all over Russia, and I'm meaning here not the loyal state-influenced press, but the independent press, they don't even need to be controlled by the presidential administration, because they are already censoring themselves, constructing a difficult balance of truths, half-truths, and silences, where there should be a single task, finding and reporting information. A second contradictory one arises. Interesting information is dangerous, so it needs to be concealed or at least meted out in doses. Today, any Russian publication, any media outlet, especially the one that is working with social or political subjects, is risking the following. To be instantly blocked without a court verdict if the content of the site could be considered extremist. You can be called a foreign agent if what you are doing is considered to be a political activity. And it could be anything, like reporting on what is going on in the Russian army, or, of course, covering the elections. You could be sued. Third thing, the gesture was slightly legal. You could be sued by the authorities or private persons if the content is viewed as obscene. And, of course, it means also propaganding homosexuality, which is a kind of a bête noire for the regime and its supporting. Or you could be suffocated financially by a number of penalties and costly legal proceedings, or simply with putting more pressure on the owners. And the worst thing is you risk to censor yourself constantly in order to avoid or minimize the risk. In this way, the entire media system as a whole is ailing. It's just that someone is corrupted by money and power, and others fall victim to constant external arm twisting and internal censorship. And I'm asking myself, what does the situation mean for the West and for Russia? And it is also a new framework, for I've been raised considering myself and my citizenship and the country I'm living in as a working part of a big Western world. And the fact that now West and Russia are being viewed by both sides as kind of direct opposites is also a great shift of the mind we have to think of. But after all, what does it mean for the West? For instance, that all the information you are getting from official or unofficial sources needs to be subjected to a careful reading and corrective. And above all, it affects the main information bubble of recent years. There is a myth of massive support for Putin, meaning that Putin and Russia are one and the same. What I want to say is that millions have been spent to convince the West precisely of this. The reality is much far from being so straightforward, but there are fewer and fewer opportunities to see that. So what does this situation mean for Russia? That in the very near future, there will be almost no remaining sources of information that can be trusted. And this against the backdrop of a mass societal depression and a growing economic crisis and a complete lack of any prospects for the future. In essence, the country could return, and quite quickly, to the Soviet standards, to times when the only way to find out what is happening in the country and the world was to look for hidden meanings in the official publications. The only thing that can counteract this is a system of free, so to say, partisan media outlets. The authorities, as the experience of the last 15 years demonstrates, have their own logic of reaction. And they go first after everything big, judging mainly by the audience numbers. After everything that caves under direct pressure. Ideally speaking, for the authorities, media has to be equaled to an owner who can be controlled or needs to be replaced. But the publications that haven't been wrought into the smooth system of briefings and agreements, media outlets that don't participate in presidential administration meetings, kind of fall outside of the authorities' comfort zone. To put it more bluntly, they'd rather not notice them. But now the balance of power is shifting. Small new-style outlets with small budgets, small staffs, with a limited menu of services, often existing as, and with the legal status of, individual blogs, are on the leading edge, in the front row, so to speak, or at the frontier. They have no masters. They have comparatively small audiences. They are diversified. Each one is trying to reach its own relatively sparse niche audience. But the total audience for this eclectic group of sites is very big, and it is united also by mistrust for the official sources of information. Broadly speaking, the audience for this internet archipelago is made up of that official 14% that were not voting for Putin in the latest presidential elections of 2012. In fact, there is a reason to assume that it was many more than that. And it is also an interesting topic we don't have time right now to discuss. And the topic is, could we rely on straightforward sociology in a country that is, in a totalitarian country that is obsessed with hiding the truth? I've just read a news piece that was saying that, it was the headline, 70% of Russians admitted they're lying to the sociologists. And what about the 30% that still didn't admit that? So the audience of that internet archipelago is at least 14%. That means millions that didn't support Putin, and that's a subset of Russians who are political conscious and active and ready for a productive dialogue with the rest of the world, for whom this dialogue maybe was never interrupted. And this is a fairly new thing. For the first time in 2.5 decades, independent journalism in Russia lacks a flagship publication. And if such appeared, its day would be numbered. It would be marked as an enemy number one. It demands work and responsibility from the reader, who is becoming simultaneously an interpreter. And it also demands effort to preserve the little that remains from the Russian media. It could become sort of beginning of a new phase, a beginning of a new era. But there is always a but. And contemporary Russia is quite ambiguous about any kind of beginnings. And this is another layer of our complicated reality. There is a big global framework to view our local situation, because everywhere, not only in Russia, the future is no more what it used to be. It is not something to aim for or something to build up collectively. And sometimes sometimes it is even not something to hope for. In the best way possible, it's simply blank and sometimes threatening, as the Hollywood with its range of anti-utopian movies lets us know. In fact, while writing some kind of an article, I was just going through the American movies box offices for the last 30 years. And what I found was striking. The last movie dealing with the future as something nice, as something to be expected, is Back to the Future. And it was, after all, 25 years ago. What we are having now is a range of anti-utopias of different kind. But in Russia, this common feeling is much more intense, more widely spread, and I could say more universal. And this feeling is something everyone agrees on, from Putin to the opposites, from peasants to intellectuals. The feeling is future is something to be afraid of, and even more to it, something to be avoided at any possible price. And I wonder, how did it come to that? What could call into existence that sort of a common consensus? It is absolutely unnamed. It is being kept in the darkness. It is hidden even from ourselves, but it still exists and unites all the stratas, all the levels of contemporary Russian society. This fear of the future, this agreement that it could make only things worse, helps maybe to answer the crucial question that interests everyone, I guess. How comes there is no Maidan in Russia? Why did the opposition stop where it did in 2012? But maybe the most urgent question that needs to be answered is another one. What happened to the idea of future? What's so wrong with it? And here is a few explanations that may help. I was telling my friends here about a brilliant paper, yet unpublished, that was written by a psychologist I was reading back in Moscow. She's a psychoanalyst, a classic post-Freudian one. She practices in Moscow. Her clientele is wide and somewhat representative. There are different ages, different circles, different educational and social levels. But what is striking, and it is quite obvious while reading her work, that how alike and how, in fact, homogeneous those different people are, and in a very special way. The whole work of an analyst is to listen to some people's dreams, and that's what she does, and that's what she writes about. And what is remarkable is, for the last 10 years, there is basically one dream she is dealing with, just one dream, with one common plot, belonging to a number of dreamers. The stories have little individual twists and turns, but the overall story is always the same. There was around a dozen. I'll tell you one that impressed me the most. The dreamer, the storyteller, is a girl. She's in her 30s. She's educated. She works as a copywriter in one big advertising agency. And what she says is, I'm having this dream that the authorities are issuing a new law. Now anyone who is losing his or her passport is to be executed, is to be killed. And I am always the unlucky one. Of course, the very moment the law is issued, I am losing my passport. And all my family is terrified. My boyfriend is crying, my dad is smoking at the balcony. But my mom, she's the wise one in the family, she is saying simply, don't worry, don't worry. It is not so awful. They will not kill you, they will just send you into an exile, you'll see. And that's exactly what is happening. But then the doorbell rings and a firing squad enters and they're taking me away. But yes, they do not kill me. They're placing me into something that is called Skotsky wagon. Again, one more word for the Russian speakers. It is a special type of a train carriage that was used previously for transporting cattle. And in Stalin's times, it was used to transport big amounts of prisoners to the faraway concentration camps. And to make the thing economically effective, there are no benches, no seats, no nothing. You're sitting on the floor or lying on the floor. You cannot look at the window because it is how to say it? Yep. But you're seeing the small holes in the woodwork that are permitting you to see some scraps of what is going on, something. And I'm sitting on that dirty floor of that Skotsky wagon. The train is going. I am trying to see anything, and all I can see is endless white plains covered with snow, with no visible trace of life, and they're lasting and lasting and lasting, and the train is going further and further. And what I'm thinking is, of course, I always knew it. I always knew it would be like that. I always knew that all my previous life, that I was enjoying the toys of my childhood, my first kiss, my mama's stories, everything I loved was just a passing fancy, something unsubstantial and totally unreliable. And the only real thing is what I am having right now, and I always knew it. It is something that I was born for. And I think it is striking, yes. And it means that at the very roots of our everyday existence lies a deep belief that reality is something you cannot rely at. There is a number of such dreams. Sometimes the dreamer is being killed in the name of the authorities by his own mother, and it is also significant. But what I mean is, under each surface, there is an ugly sub-reality of what may happen, the real thing that always means treachery and death. Every turn of your life can lead you to disintegration. And the dreams say you can never rely on anything, even or especially on your loved ones. You can notice that in the dream world, mother, that means also motherland, both of them never hesitate to betray you or kill you. And I guess it's quite an explanation for anyone to wish to postpone the future, and for the longest time possible, even if you understand at your conscious level that it's a simple mental construct, a result of decades and decades of lasting trauma that no one had been working with. It is just too deeply rooted to be dismissed. So if you live in Russia, you feel that you have no future, and that even if your present is deeply flawed and compromised, if you need to choose between them, you sure take the present. And it leads you straight to that informal pact with the Putin's dogma that makes you wish history to end. And of course, the idea of history to be done with is not something new. But as you remember, when Alexander Kojève was speaking of the end of history and that eternal, everlasting present, he was meaning something completely different. What he says is the state is to become so effective in terms of solving problems and fulfilling needs of its citizens that the state and the citizen are making a pact, thus permitting history to stop. In a way, yes, this vision is grotesquely similar to that hidden pact that exists between the Russian state and its citizenship. But our pact is revised. It has a different base. What it is saying is not everything is perfect, so let's stop the clock. It might become much worse, so let us stop the clock. It means the state may be faulted or even failed, but we still agree to leave it like that, to prevent the further, yet unknown catastrophe. But still, the present time we're experiencing is so ugly, we are unable to face it. So we turn to the only thing that still seems stable, the time past. And what we are seeing there is also quite unpredictable. From the Russian point of view, the past is a matter of fiction. It is not something stable or solid. It is something subject to constant changes and revisions. After the 70 years of Soviet official history, i.e. of rewriting the big narrative to make it serve the current situation. After all that years and years and decades of erased memory, demolished portraits, rewritten textbooks, we know our lesson well enough. It is that history is also totally unreliable, that there is nothing final about it. It is never about the truth. It's about what they want you to say right now. And under the grand flow of the official history lie the deeper currents of small-scale and other secret history, kept only in the family, and you never know which story to choose. At that precise point, history itself is becoming your story of choice. It effectively turns into literature. For now, there is no point, no spot in the whole history of Russia, Soviet or pre-Soviet, that could unite all the people and become a base for a big consensus, a historical unity that would mean the same for all the people. It is not Yeltsin, who is of course no point for any kind of consensus, but not Yeltsin, not Gorbachev, nor Lenin, nor Stalin, not World War II, not even Catherine the Great, I guess, and definitely not the perestroika or revolution. The past now is a battlefield which is always revisited and revised. The latest point of revisal, comically, is the story of Decembrists, traditionally viewed by centuries as heroes struggling to save the country from slavery. Now they are officially being treated as traitors, as the foreign agents, as one can see, for instance, at a brand new exhibition in Moscow State Historical Museum. Yeah. I was impressed, yeah. And what is even more interesting is that they are trying to make the public feel that the Decembrists and their wives are different stories. The girls are the saints, keeping the scrapers intact, keeping the tradition, behaving in the Christian-based, traditionally feminine way, and the husbands are awful. They've been at Paris in 1812, so they were kind of corrupted, I guess. But still, the past, multi-layered and fragile as it is, still is the only narrative we can refer to, and the only mirror we can face. So the past becomes a starting point for remixes, collages, and exercises in a style. It becomes a source of false, empty of any meaning examples. How it works now is very visible in the official media. You are seeing something that feels like a quotation, but you never know if it is forged or not. And even where does it come from? It could come from the 30s or 70s, from the Pravda or from Sturmer. You never can be sure where does it come from, but there is one thing you can be sure in. You know the author doesn't know his source. He's just, and he doesn't care. What he notices, it sounds good. It could be used. The big mantra is that everything is relative. And this mantra is something the authorities are referring to when they are trying to restore that legendary, mythical, never existing big Russian past in a posh style. The big Russian past is just a patchwork of misquotations and false evidences that has nothing to do with the real picture of a Russian past or any past, but they do not care. The patchwork is hybrid, as the war in Ukraine was, and it has nothing to do with the truth. But the state insists now that the whole concept of truth is kind of old-fashioned. And this totally artificial version of the past is in fact the picture of future that the Russian state is promising to its people. I feel that this obsession with the past is something very deep and private. I am subject to it too. But what I think is our only chance of getting ourselves a future, or even a present time, is to stop with the past and to force the country to see that the future, unknown as it is inevitable. If we want it or not. Yep. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments, prophecies? Please line up.
First, I just want to say thank you so much. It's really very significant for us to experience from your perspective what's going on, because many of us have not been, especially recently, and it's very important, as you said. So my question is, especially being here at Stanford and having connections here, are there people here in the Western media for which we are infamous who are supporting? I mean, this has been, goes back to when I was years ago, who are supporting the media there, or the attempts of new media or free media or anything like that in various ways, economically or otherwise?
Thank you very much for your question. I'll try to answer. The story is kind of complicated, but what I can say is the state tried to do all that it can to prevent the Western to prevent the West to be involved in any kind of dealing with the current Russian media outlets. The famous law on foreign agents is something to do precisely that. I'm running a crowdfunding website that is existing solely by public donations. But the interesting thing is, when my Western friends are trying to wire some money for the site, they are unable to do it because we cannot receive it. If we are getting just a $5 note via bank transfer, and it could be linked to the West, you cannot. It doesn't mean you cannot be sure that the state will not press you, try to make you a foreign agent, will sue you, or find any other way of endangering your life. It may be dangerous. And of course there is one more law against the undesirable organizations that is even more serious. For instance, no one is able now in Russia to work with the Open Society because they are treated as the undesired organization. They did lots of good for raising a level of science, of information in Russia, but it doesn't matter. If you are dealing with an undesirable organization, you can be simply jailed. So it is kind of complicated. But I don't think that this has to prevent us from making bridges, being in dialogue, and even having some projects together. For instance, Kolta is working closely with the German foundation Heinrich Böll Stiftung, big and powerful human rights and ecological organization. We are doing together different kinds of projects. One of them means a lot for me. We are making a book of interviews with the former Russian dissidents of the 70s. And it is a matter of utmost importance, not only because well, I am a big enemy of historical analogies. I hate when someone is asking me, is it already the Russian 37th year, or maybe only the year 1972? It is not 37th, of course, and not 72. It is, well, 2016, and it's completely different. I think that the bad examples are kind of former and negative corridor in terms of futurology, and that's why they do not work. But we still have lots of things to learn from the dissidents. And when you're getting a phone call from the KGB, from the FSB, there is no difference, and they're asking you to come over for a small talk, you'd better have to know what to do, because the method still stays the same. And that's the most important thing, but also these fascinating people are getting older and older. We're losing them. And maybe it's quite a time to try to catch up with their stories, to make as full a compendium as we can do. And we're only starting with this, of course. But now we are going to publish this fall, we are going to publish a first book of interviews with the dissidents of all stratas, of all levels, of different, even sometimes to people who are coming from different republics of former Soviet Union, from Azerbaijan to Lithuania. For instance, we are having a good interview with Thomas Venslova. It's quite fascinating. And the book has to be published in the fall. And we couldn't do it without the moral and financial support of Heinrich Böll Foundation. So I guess that the legal system in Russia is living in a framework of delayed precedent. They are issuing some kind of a horrible new law, and then they are just waiting. They may use it or not. You are in the know that the law exists. They know you know. It works like that. What they mean to do is to keep you horrified. That's how it is working.
It was announced today that Putin is forming a national guard, reporting directly to him, I believe, who is ex-bodyguard. And I was wondering if you were aware of that and what you make of it. Is that another step towards maybe dictatorship?
Well, talking of this kind of steps, their name is also Legion. But I don't even know the story, because I was traveling all day long. But if we're again looking or not looking for the historical precedents, well, you remember the ways how Oprichnina was formed in the times of Ivan the Terrible. Maybe it is something similar, but of course I have to read the news first. And in fact, what is also similar to is Kadyrov's private guards. Maybe it works like that.
Can you go back to Russia after this kind of a speech?
Absolutely. No, that's what I particularly want to stress. What is going on has no precedence. It is not Stalin's times or Brezhnev's times. The reality is much more diverse. It is much more fragmented. A friend of mine was asking me if she is able to go to Russia safely after talking some politics on Skype with her Russian friend. She can, and I can. It is not as dangerous if you're not getting involved into real politics. And this is something meaningful. It is something that lies at the roots of that consensus I was talking about. It is a long story because it was formed in the beginning of last decade. The consensus was meaning that if you're not getting into political field, you can have you can enjoy total freedom of private life. No one was interested, no one was concerned, no one was intruding. But now, as the state is intruding more and more aggressively, things are getting different. But still, you can say whatever you want on the internet still, but there is a law that can get you into jail for sharing some stuff on Facebook. And right now I know of 2 or maybe even 3 legal processes against some ordinary people in the Russia's provinces. They're always trying that new kind of behavior in the provinces against some guy or girl who was simply sharing something on Facebook, and we are still to see the results. So what I guess is the logics of Putin's state is not to keep people jailed, but to keep them horrified, and it is having the same effect. It works.
There was a book that came out. There was a book that was authored by Masha Gessen some years ago, not too long ago, Two Faces of Putin, where she suggested that the younger Russians were not in favor of Putin, even though the appearance was that, like you said at the outset of your remarks, that the government wanted to make it appear that most people were in full support of Putin. And the point that I thought she was making in the book was that she thinks that there is hope that the young Russians will somehow become liberated from the existing regime. I'm wondering what you think of that.
Thank you. I think I agree more or less totally, because, well, I know the youngsters, and they are really different. They are free, and they are completely unused to any kind of pressure, even if in their private lives. And I also don't think that the majority of Putin's supporters is really a majority. It is much more diverse, it's much more dispensed. In fact, when I'm thinking of it, I guess that the methods that Russian sociology is using are maybe kind of, well, they have to be maybe renewed in the framework of what is going on. Because, well, for instance, they are making polls using phone calls. And just imagine that. You're a Russian citizen, you're sitting at some apartment at Tula, and someone calls you up and says, Maria Mikhailovna, are you going to vote for Putin? Of course. First, I think they know my name. Second, I'm answering, of course I will. And an important thing to understand about it is the Russians were living for over 70 years in a climate of double truth. There was an official facade kind of truth, and the unofficial one to be kept at home. And I'm 100% sure that the population is treating the sociologists anyone who is, wearing jacket and tie and asks questions as the officials, and they are not answering them, they will not give them anything sincerely. It is just a way of being polite in a way. They know what are expected to say, they say it.
Well, I have a question about humor. And so let me introduce the topic first. Because, first, I'm incredibly impressed by your essay, impressed and inspired. And the image that I'm getting is that of a panopticon-like state. These laws are pending someplace where they may never be used, but you know that they might be used against you. So, of course, just like prisoner in panopticon, you control your movements. I come from Poland, and democracy in Poland is presently being dismantled at a terrible speed, and despite various calls for stopping the government proceeds to dismantle the Constitutional Tribunal. The journalists are quitting, and so on. At the same time, the democratic opposition in Poland is using humor to ridicule the government's proceedings. And now, while I am enthusiastic about various actions in social media, at the same time I fear that we may be ravishing, we may be making ourselves comfortable with these amazing actions, and the government will proceed anyway with introducing very terrible laws. And here I would bring a Russian example actually from 2013, the introduction of the anti-gay propaganda law, which I read in the New Yorker. Large populations of Russians also ridiculed. There were jokes about sodomy and how soon will they proceed to penalize oral sex. Still, the law was introduced and passed, and people stopped laughing. So my question, to wrap it up, your take on the use of humor and how effective it can be.
Thank you very much for your comment. It is really enlightening. And I find so much similarities with the trends in Poland and in Russia, and even in the political speech, even in terms of style. But it is interesting that I was discussing exactly that with my friends a few days ago. I was thinking of the totalitarian examples of the past and trying to guess if the horrible things of times past were as much funny for people living and suffering from that regimes as they are for us. I wonder if it is so, and I guess not. From what I can get from the diaries of the Soviet, from the Soviet times, or from German diaries of certain times, from letters, the situation was regarded, of course, as something unprecedented, and there was not, enough space for humor, even the black humor. But there is lots of space for it in the Russian cultural space. And I guess the answer is the following. This state doesn't have any kind of inner meaning. It's a wrapping without a candy. There is no ideological construct or even an attempt to create an ideological construct. It is a completely unmotivating false pretense. And that is what is making it so comical. It is imitating the movements of a creature that knows what it does, but it doesn't. Speaking of that LGBT story, this situation is particularly awful in Russia because it is really a kind of a more or less official consensus of the masses and the state. Gender issues are something to be constantly ridiculed. It is something funny. And, well, I can give you lots of examples. For instance, there was this Tolechki debate in the Russian internet maybe a year and a half ago. A big, good, totally reliable, independent website was publishing a piece on feminism. They were trying to do their best. They made interviews, they were bringing some historical facts. It was a nice piece of work. But they had to promote it in the social networks. And what they did was the tagline was, now you guys will know how to behave with chicks, so they would be satisfied. And exactly, even using the term chicks, Tolechki. Tolechki is really a cow, young cow. I forgot the exact English word, but it is the same thing, yeah. It is outrageous. And what was especially tragic, not even comic, was that the editorial board was absolutely denying the fact there was something sinister about this tagline. They simply didn't understand what was going on and why the feminists were arguing and why people were writing letters. They just was like, well, you just don't catch a joke. It is funny. We don't want anything. We didn't want to say anything bad. We were just joking. Look at the article. It's so good. And this complete lack of understanding is something very much characteristic for the Russian media. The second example I have is we were, after the Tolechki debate, we've published a big and good column of Bella Rapoport, one of the leading feminist minds of contemporary Russia, and it was a good article with huge reading audience, about maybe 100,000 of page views, quite enough for a gender talk. And then I did, as the article was so popular and the girl was so popular, I decided, let's make something useful with it, using it as a working tool. And we were making our own piece of domestic violence, the subject that is totally unexistent in the Russian intellectual space. And I was absolutely sure that it would have a bigger audience, because it was quite useful. There were, telephones of psychological support, of addresses of shelters, lots of interesting and useful information. And we know, or we don't know, we can suspect, we know the official statistic, and we can expect we can imagine the unofficial, because women are forced not to address the police or even the medicals in cases of domestic violence. And the reading audience of that piece, that was very good, was 3 thousands people. Feel the difference, I mean.
Thank you for your nice speech. I would like to challenge you a little bit. I carefully listened to your story, your narrative, and actually I can summarize in such a way that actually Putin, who was brought to power by Yeltsin, so Putin, evil man, and his cronies captured power in Russia and then deprived Russian people from freedom of speech, freedom of meetings. So basically, in simplified ways, what you said. Don't you think it's a situation really quite opposite? It's Russian society, Russian people transform Putin, who was originally like a regular theft, kleptoman, and they transformed him this monster. Actually, everything he did through this history was supported by Russian people. This implementing of Soviet anthem, big support. And his popularity boosted after he invaded, annexation of Crimea and invasion in Ukraine. So I think if Putin suddenly died today, tomorrow will be somebody like him or even worse. 85% of support right now. 15% doesn't like him, but they still support that Crimea belongs to Russia, like Navalny, Khodorkovsky, who was here. His first statement, yes, Crimea should belong to Russia. When he was here, we greeted him, but he declined to answer this question here, but it's what he said. So 85% support Putin, another 15%, maybe 10% support actually even worse things. So basically, if we talk seriously, we have to put right diagnosis of this situation, because otherwise we are just cheating ourselves and we never understand what really happened in Russia. So what do you think about this?
Thank you for your comment. In fact, I didn't say anything of things you've mentioned. I never said anything about Yeltsin bringing Putin to power. The overall situation was much more complex, and I even say nothing about Putin being an evil man. I think he's an evil man, but I don't think it adds something. It is useful information. It's just something I think. What I was trying to describe is a certain kind of sensibility that is common for Putin, his government, his people, and it is not about who votes for whom. It is about fears and dreams and desires, and it is something that is really shaping history. Well, speaking of the majority of Russian population, the 85% who are supporting something, okay, I'll tell a joke, but it's not really a joke, it's a real story, it happened to me. I have a hairdresser, and I adore her. I love things she's doing with my hair. I'm visiting her for years. And usually we talk business, shapes, colors, whatever. But last summer, she suddenly decided to talk politics with me. And I was just sitting there, and she was like, well, do you know that everyone now wants to stop any kind of contact with America, with the States, because no one can, everyone is afraid of them, they want to dominate the world. And I'm just like sitting there and thinking, trying to understand what is more important for me, expressing my political views or keeping my hairdresser. And I'm just simply sitting there, keeping my poker face, saying nothing. And then suddenly I hear that click-clack of the scissors by my ear is stopping, and she's, giving me that quick sideways glance in the mirror, and then she completely changed the tune, and she's saying, and by the way, I've been to a supermarket yesterday, and there is no cheese. What did we do at Crimea? What do we do at Ukraine? And speaking about, speaking of the views of that extra big audience that is totally manipulated by hundreds of media outlets that are totally controlled by the state. They have hugest audience numbers, and they are still not completely brainwashed. They are still, know their professional interests. It gives me kind of hope. I hope that people, still know their own interest. They are just cautious or overly cautious. But speaking of who changed whom, I guess it's a mutual process. Putin's way of viewing things was evolving with time, and he was shaping and shaped by the same things his citizenship is. It is much more complicated, and after all, it all is a result of a long-term process of 100 years of constant catastrophes. It is, I guess, it is something that kind of mutes down real, pronounced political thinking. And yes, if Putin dies, the situation might turn to worse. But think about the way this reality was constructed. Think about lots of subtle tricks used to make the complicated, skeptical, politically active in different ways audience, popularity of population, of the 90s. What turned them into that, willing to do anything mass of present decade? I think it is, it is no time to think about it in direct opposites. Who is guilty, who is wrong. The question is not who is guilty, but what has to be done.
Okay, if I do a follow-up to his question?
Mm-hmm.
What I took away from his question is a little different, mm-hmm. and it's the part of what part of the Russian population empowered Vladimir Putin, and the question is relevant because in our current election in the US, we have a Donald Trump who has been a minor figure, mm-hmm. But is suddenly a very major figure. Yeah. And so there's certainly a lot of reality to the people making the man or empowering the man. And so my question is, what amount of reality is there to that in Russia, where it's obviously a very different environment, mm-hmm. Very different scenario. And so, a lot of things came into the making of Vladimir Putin, but is there a percentage of his being in power that was, with Donald Trump, people are disillusioned and they're looking for someone who says he can solve their problems, in spite of the fact whether or not he can solve their problems, but that they're looking for someone to say he can solve their problems. And I wonder how much of that is true in Russia with Vladimir Putin, that people will support him because he says Russia is powerful, Russia is strong, Russia has this future. And so I just wonder what you think about that.
I agree. And in fact, there is so many similarities between Trump and Putin that it is remarkable. In fact, some Russian website was running a test making people guess guess the quotation, who it belongs to. Is it Putin or is it Trump? And I tried to pass the test and I failed. But I think that the problem with Putin is not that he sells some ideals or some notions or some versions of the future I disagree with. My problem with Putin or with the state, I strongly dislike people saying Russians are doing that or this or that. Russians are, I don't know, entering Syria. It is not the Russians, in fact, it's the state behaving. Russians are just sitting somewhere watching for the TV, watching the TV. What Putin sells is false evidence, false stability, false hope. There is a habit in contemporary Russian media to speak about the 90s that were a tragic decade, a decade of great shift, great trauma, and great cultural diversity and richness. It is an interesting time. It's not simple, but there is this tendency to flatten them in the 90s a bit. And what they're saying is there are the wild, lihie 90s and the stable next decade, zeros. And what is striking is half of the most terrible things that happened in post-Soviet times happened in the stable new first decade of the 21st century, like Beslan, like the Second Chechen War, like explosions in Moscow and terror attacks and everything. And they are still considered to be stable. What frightens me is our ability to believe in a written world, to believe things people are saying you, never even meaning to mean anything. That is a problem.
Thank you all for coming. We still have plenty of food and time for informal discussion out there, so hope you all join us and continue the talk.